Good afternoon and welcome back to our 24-hour global #Changing Risk Day. For those of you who have just tuned in, my name is Kinley. I'm the Content Director for Strategic Risk and I'll be moderating our webinars in this part of the world. And for those of you who've stayed with us, welcome back. We did consider actually maybe launching a competition and awarding the person that has stayed on the longest. So we're probably, maybe I would say if calculations are correct, perhaps about 12, 13 hours into our 24-hour day. So I will be sort of mentioning the longest standing attendee. Now, earlier, we heard from Hans Lesso in Denmark, who presented on how to implement risk-based decision-making. And our webinar series continues to move around Europe, and we're landed back in the UK with a presentation from Danny Wong, who is the CEO of Goat Risk Solutions, and who will present on how to use data to better engage with the C-suite. Before I hand over to Danny, a short housekeeping announcement. As with our earlier presentation, this is very much an interactive session, and it has been designed to give you the opportunity to quiz and scrutinize our speakers and ask as many questions as you so desire. You can do that by clicking on the Q&A box, which you can find on your Zoom toolbar. Our sessions will generally run for 40 minutes on the hour, every hour, with about a short 20-minute break between each presentation. And there may be cases where we go slightly over, but you can expect a new presentation to go live on the hour. And with that, I will now hand over to Danny Wong.
Thank you, Kin. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect, great. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you, Strategic Risk and Kin, for thinking about such a bonkers crazy platform to run 24 hours. I feel quite lucky to talk to you, have this opportunity to speak to you about how risk management can be positioned to resonate better with C-suite. And yes, indeed, having data as part of that is part of the solution. So I am trying to change my slides. There we go. I am Danny Wong, a seasoned risk practitioner, and have been in the sector for 20 years. Nothing too interesting about that, but the highlight, I would say, from my career to date is the opportunity from 2016 to 2018, where I led a risk maturity benchmark study that it had engaged with over 150 organizations. And from that, I was also able to and had the privilege of interviewing about 50 plus senior risk executives, CFOs, or heads of audit types of individuals to really get under the skin of what it is that they do, the good practices within risk management, and indeed some of the challenges that they face. What I reflected on that was that I heard that risk management really hasn't evolved that far, hasn't come that far over the period that I had been in the sector, and that many organizations were still struggling with engaging at the boardroom, affecting decision-making and demonstrating value. So all the frustrations that we've challenged with were still prevalent and things that I had found in the risk maturity benchmark study. One of the interesting points that I also picked up, which affected my next career decision, was the fact that only 25% of respondents had used risk management software. And as a practitioner, buyer, consultant type of person, I was always thinking, well, there's a lot of providers out there on the market, but why is it that so few or such a large proportion of companies not engaging with software? And that was one of the questions that I probed amongst a lot of the people I had the privilege of speaking to. So with that, I launched over a year ago, launched Goat Risk Solutions to develop something that was catered directly for the C-suite audience. What I wanted to do first and foremost, and it was really relevant for the way we developed our technology, was, and a lot of the people that are in the software space, they'll understand this, is to really, really get under the skin of the persona. So actually, I really liked that idea around, so what I found was an exercise called the big head persona type of an exercise, which you'd see in the emotional intelligence kind of spheres, but apply that to our C-suite persona, or any stakeholder that you really want to engage with, whether it be your CEO, committee member, wife, husband, partner, anyone that you want to win over. It helps to really understand their thinking, feeling, seeing, what they say, what they're doing, and what they're hearing. So I've put that together in the slide that's in front of you. In terms of thinking and feeling, it's what is it that really counts for them? What are their major preoccupations? What are their worries and aspirations? In fact, we know C-suite audience are under tremendous pressure from all directions. What are they seeing from in terms of internal management information and reports and activities from not necessarily risk management, but from everyone else? So what types of reports do they read? What are they seeing from the markets? What kind of information do they get from that? What are they reading? And then, of course, how do they, what are they saying? How do they conduct themselves, either informally, if you've got any opportunity to correspond with these C-suite individuals, also their public addresses, and of course, in this day and age, their Twitters, their LinkedIn, their blogs. So what are they writing? And on their perspective, what are they hearing from the rest of their team, their boss, the pressures that they're feeling, and even external sources. So if you speak to a lot of the C-suite individuals, actually they're under quite a lot of pressure from the analyst community or shareholders. And then ultimately, what are they doing, and the actions that they're taking, the decisions that they're making, their tendencies and behaviors, and even actions from the rest of the team, which are a lot of times the manifestation of the C-suite individual. So I thought, here's an opportunity to really think differently, or think from a stakeholder perspective. And actually, for me, doing that to a generic audience, a generic C-suite persona, had given me a lot of insights. And starting like a training session we had this week, we done the exact same thing, but walked the learners through a exercise where they were thinking about a specific C-suite persona or individual that they wanted to win over, which is the next slide I've got here. The key takeaway, of course, is there's no right or wrong answer, but perhaps by understanding what these stakeholders, important stakeholders that you want to win over, by really understanding their pain points, you might then reflect back on what you're asking of them or what you're presenting to them, and whether or not those content materials that you're presenting will in fact help them or hinder them, or perhaps that's the reason why there's a bit of a tick box mindset, because they're still being polite, they're giving you the time, but in terms of genuine decision making and taking actions beyond that, perhaps they've got other priorities. I found that to be quite an insightful and enlightening process for myself. I mean, it's wonderful, necessary in terms of developing technology, but in terms of genuinely thinking about how you do risk management, then perhaps somebody that is seeing data or much deeper information from in terms of MI from other departments, content that has recommendations and options and decisions to be made, it makes you reflect back on, have we got the right framework, the right reporting templates and content? and how does this content help this stakeholder that I want to win over and to be that trusted advisor for. So I encourage you to take a moment to try that offline, of course, for specific personas that you want to win over. So from those insights, it's actually shaped and softened and developed my delivery in terms of risk workshops, risk communication to senior board level or C-suite audiences. I tend to start with a slide that sets the context, which is, yes, risk is everywhere. We know risk affects share prices, reputations, lives, health and safety. Regulation is a big factor. And of course, well-being in jobs and sort of your portfolio and your employees, traditional accounting types of problems as well. A lot of traditional downside risks are risks that C-suite audience, they fully understand, they know it's real, they know they're accountable even. Um, Increasingly, they're understanding that it's personal. You know, this isn't just the reputation of the company that, oh my gosh, I'm the CEO, CFO, or board member of these companies, and actually my name is on the hook, or I'm ultimately accountable. So there is that movement towards that. But on the other hand, a lot of the C-suite and senior executives, they're focused on growing the business. And of course, a lot of risk practitioners think of opportunity as another area that is the sort of two heads of the same coin. I think of it actually, I try not to overcomplicate it. I see it as a longer term risk that with the change of society, technology, that actually businesses need to evolve. You know, all that strategy talk is not an opportunity or some nice to have. It's actually, if you don't deliver those strategies, we may struggle to remain relevant. And I say that the term relevance applies not only to the Kodak, HMVs, obvious types of sectors, but actually we know that that's far broader. Just as an example, in the UK, there's a tremendous pressure on the high street retailers and shopping due to Amazon and online shopping. But one of the client contacts that I've been speaking to, who is an online retailer, a very large one, and had been around for the last 20 years, is talking about how, yeah, we're under threat from the newer ones that have been around for 2 years. So the whole relevance piece is a challenge not only for the traditional businesses, but all businesses. And I look at that from a risk perspective as well. So that's very much my starting point, because I always say that, you know, whether or not HMV has best practice in IT security or health and safety is probably irrelevant. This is a slide that I put in front of a lot of my C-suite audience, and it's because I want to tell them exactly what I know about what they're thinking. That the risk challenge in the previous slide is real, but we know that a lot of C-suite audience and a lot of companies and senior executives, that they're doing it to tick the box. We understand that there are lots of motivations and reasons for them to do that. We understand that they feel as though sometimes certain risk frameworks are too process oriented. Sometimes when you're reliant upon impact and likelihood heat map types of scoring, that ultimately is a finger in the air, where we, when we did our persona exercise, recognized that these individuals receive a lot more data from other departments. There might be a view that risks never change, or that there's a complacency because this is always the way we've worked. There is an aspect of this is what we write, but we intuitively know what the risks are. And we know that there are challenges within our profession, which is the risk managers aren't necessarily at the leadership table. Sometimes there's a perception that traditional risk managers are a bit are seen as blockers. Obviously, the progressive types are enablers of success. Risk management just unable to deliver value. So we see that there's an obvious challenge where the earlier slide we said risk is real, it's getting worse, it's pretty harsh out there. This is normality, which is we need to be managing lots of risk. It's increasing. We need to be taking the right risks in order to keep evolving and staying relevant. But how come our risk management is not good enough? Why is it still a bit of ticking of the boxes? And that's the problem that we as the risk professional, we put that in front of the board and we say, that's my problem, right? So that's for us to help them solve. And we need to be bridging that gap. So that's where I step back and I say, well, how do we bridge that gap? Let's start not from the framework and process and the templates. Let's talk about the guiding principles. We go in and say that what we're looking for is raising empowerment and accountability in the business, making sure that the risk owners have what's necessary, the resources and capacity and capability to do something of those risks that are assigned to them. Transparency, we understand that regardless of the issue, whatever the headline is, somebody in the organization probably saw something that either could have given you extra time or probably could have prevented these crisis situations. Being able to have transparency, and that's a two-way street, by the way, enabling top down as well as bottom up to communicate in as clear as way and effective way as possible. If we're not encouraging challenging the status quo, then we go back to the relevance question, that the pace of change, technology, society, everything, it's happening way too quick for us to be complacent and being happy about being a 100-year-old company, particularly in the UK. That's that is the starting point. Is there's lots of long established organizations, but actually those are the ones that need to be making the biggest strides towards moving forward. Holistic thinking. Now we know the board provides that, and we know senior executives think that, but that one of the great things that an enterprise risk practitioner has is that we can see that exact same lens, because we're marching across the entire organization and have that holistic view. But what we can see is that lots of the other individuals, our colleagues working in these organizations, they're more thinking within their silos, which makes the seeing of the bigger picture, seeing the wood from the trees, far more difficult. We also know that risk management is not just for these risk reports, not just for these risk registers. It's not a standalone process. It's actually something that you need to do all the time, but in particular when we're making the big decisions for the organization, the big setting of the strategies, making the partnerships, procuring for the next strategic partner. And finally, data has got to be a part of the solution. We remember that the C-suite audience think about sometimes this finger in the air. There's a roll of their eyes when they see it. Well, let's just put everything in the right context, bring data into the risk dialogue, and with that, be able to really inform decision-making, because lots of people think of risk management as decision-making. Well, there's no way anyone could make any decisions based on judgment, finger in the air, traffic lights. It's the numbers. So I put them all together. There's a little nice way to remember it. It's etched. Please take that away. I'm not saying those are the only ones and must be ones, but they're ones that I've come up with. What I challenge is that if you're presenting that to a board or a senior executive and you're the person saying this, if you're able to convince them that this is something that is easy to say, we definitely want to have these things, and highlight the fact that these are aspirations, or that there are gaps, or that there are challenges, and that you need the board, the company, the senior executive to support and improve these aspects, these principles. What I can guarantee you is that they don't think you're a box ticker. What I could tell you is that they probably reflect back and think this risk manager, risk professional is a leader in our organization. Someone that even in a cost-cutting environment, we may think twice about picking him, because they're there to help us move the business forward. They're there to challenge the status quo. Why would we decide to make that individual redundant when there are others that are in the organization, perhaps just working within their businesses. So it's a great slide or approach that I would say for personal resilience, but also in terms of impact. This is what I'm asking boards and senior executives to support. Not a framework, not a process, not a document, just these guiding principles. Now, of course, supporting this is a risk management process. We know how simplicity resonates with this audience. So one of the most simple risk management processes that I've come across, nothing that I take credit for, I know it's out there, 4 steps: identify, assess, treat, and monitor. The only slight nuance that I like to have, because I take quite a practical approach with the senior executives, I describe risk management as a problem-solving process. So really identify what your problems are. Assessment is a prioritization exercise. Prioritize your problems so you make sure you're focused on the right things. Treat in terms of controls, actions, but also thinking innovatively and challenging the status quo. And monitor. Monitor traditionally risk registers, and I've done that over many different organizations. Monitoring, we typically go around, speak to our risk owners and say, you know, what's the latest? What's the update? Right? It might be an arrow, it might be a paragraph, but rarely is it data, key risk indicators. And actually that's the place where I dial up in terms of my approach to risk management. I'm just going to do a little bit more deep into each one of these, but very quickly. In terms of risk identification, I don't look for 40, 150, you know, these big numbers of risks at any forum, any department, right? Even at the board level. I think anything more than 10, you already start losing the focus. So what we're looking for are those top 10 risks, or 8 to 12, if that's what it ends up being. One of the good models that you would have read throughout your different risk management textbooks and frameworks, strategic, tactical, operational. I think it's a wonderful framework that helps people think holistically, right? So that's the point of it. I know it's not one size fits all, but when you're brainstorming, it's good to have a little model just to say, right, are we thinking longer term? Are we thinking about challenges and mega trends that affect our business model? Are we thinking about change, projects, transactions, as well as the more obvious ones around the day-to-day people, systems, processes, compliance, and whatnot? So holistic thinking, a simple model, not over complex. And I also don't try to force people to say, oh, is that one a strategic one, or is that one a tactical one? This is a model to help you think, not to shimmy things in and force them into one chunk or another. Because in fact, if you think of risks, they may have strategic elements as well as day-to-day elements, as well as financial or transaction tactical elements. In terms of risk prioritization, we know about these heat maps, impact and likelihood. I spend the time to explain this to my key stakeholders, and I put it in the context of, I understand that it's a judgment call. I understand that the definitions behind these high, medium, lows, and 1 to 5s are broad buckets, you know, 5 to 15 million, 25 million plus, things like that. But I explained to them the necessity of doing this so that we can compare all the risks against the same set of definitions, using the same set of perspectives even. And that gives me the opportunity to educate them a little bit about inherent, residual, and target risks as well. So that's just a little piece that we give to them. We don't want to over-index on it, but we explain the necessity for having it. We accept that it's a judgment call, but the use of it is to use it for prioritization, okay? In terms of key risk monitoring, I've skipped risk treatment. I know that that's an aspect, very traditional risk management in terms of identifying controls and taking actions. And I've moved on to risk monitoring. So bringing key risk indicators into the risk discussion is always been there. It's not innovation. It's not a new bit of thinking, but still many companies struggle to do that effectively. And I just start with the simple things. If someone says there's an issue about talent or turnover of staff, I just quickly ask, well, what is the turnover of staff? What was it, what was it last year? Or how does that compare against the audience, the competitors? In terms of the headline, data wrapped around the risk narrative, as you get to the point where there's more and more data within your risk dialogue, there's different ways to visualize that, of course, and graphs and whatnot. But I like to wrap it around a narrative that says, so what? Because even though it's very easy for senior executives to get inundated with data and then therefore not able to see the wood from the trees from a data perspective as well, you really need to have the big so what within each of the data points or at the level above that. But it's quite easy. It comes back to what gets measured gets managed. So we seek out the, if this is the big risk, how is it that we manage it? How do we measure it? How do you know you're winning? What does good look like? What's the performance look like? And then a very quick example, looking at IT security. Well, we know it's important, first of all. Of course it's there. What a board member really wants to know is, are we good at managing this? So are we good at IT security? Well, yes, if someone, a CIO or head of IT security will say, yes, we are. And are we happy? Are we going to take that away? Or do we ask, how do we know? Can you prove it? And that's where we're starting to look for some of the data points around it. And once you have the data points, these are not data points that have clear targets. So that's where the third question is, well, how good is good enough? Well, if patch management measures tell you that 50% of your servers and computers are patched, have the latest patch, well, what's your judgment on that? Is that good enough? So just to summarize, and I'm conscious of time, how do you engage with the C-suite? Well, let's start with those guiding principles. Let's keep the process really simple. Let's find out what's real, because that's what they're looking for. They need true insights, different perspectives, decision-making, comfort and assurance is another aspect of feeling comfortable and having the data and evidence behind it. What data and facts are available, because those are more credible over the scores and the traffic lights. Are we innovating? Are we bringing new ideas to challenge the status quo? But also, are there tangible benefits, and can we hear those? Okay. Slight whirlwind there. Thank you very much. I think what I'm hoping to do is give you a few new ideas, but I do open up the floor for any questions, explanations, or even your own views, experiences that you've had doing similar things in your organizations.
Excellent, Dan. Thank you very much for a very inspiring presentation. I'm going to kickstart the Q&A session by sharing again some preliminary data from our up-and-coming Changing Risk survey report. And this comment that I'm going to share plays devil's advocate in a way. So I'm just going to read this out to you. Our respondent says, many companies overcomplicate ERM and focus too much on capturing risk data in a non-consistent fashion and in cumbersome risk registers. The information is not used to drive risk-informed decisions. What's your reaction to that?
I think that's certainly a risk to taking a data-led approach. And that's dependent. The risk manager has a role to play to quality check, sense check these things, as well as encourage the board and governance committees to do the same. So for example, if you own a risk and you're the subject matter expert, really it's that subject matter expert that says, these are, based on my professional opinion, these are the relevant metrics that should tell a story. And really having that so what and the story along with the numbers gives a very comfortable message out to the C-suite. So there shouldn't be here's a bunch of numbers, smoke and mirrors to confuse everybody. But if that does happen, and I'm not surprised that it does, then it's for the C-suite committees to challenge back and say, well, okay, I'm not an expert, you are, but I'm a business professional with 30 years, 40 years of experience. What you're talking about doesn't seem to make sense to me. And the onus and the challenge goes back to the risk owner. So us as a risk profession, we're facilitating and putting grease to the engine. We don't own those metrics, but what we're providing is a framework that says we recognize data can be useful and important. There are rubbish in, rubbish out situations, and we need to screen against that. But not having data, going back to simplicity, pure simplicity, impact likelihood 5 by 5 with nothing else, gives us a different outcome, which is ticking boxes, finger in the air, but it matches well, I only have 2 minutes on the agenda of the board, so that's all I could afford. Well, that doesn't help move anything forward, doesn't add any value whatsoever. I hope that answers the question, Kin.
It certainly does. Your presentation has certainly stimulated a load of questions from our audience. And as much as I would love to continue asking some of my own, I'm going to pick on a question from the member of the audience. So here goes. You mentioned holistic thinking as one of your guiding principles. How can you leverage data from the shop floor level and aggregate this information to support enterprise level decision making and what senior leaders should be worried about? And then he goes on to say, simply rolling up risks in an ERM system isn't ideal. So can you recommend a practical approach or an example?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of metrics, there is so much data in organizations, yet so little as well. And I hope that makes sense. Nothing of useful quality, tons of it, but nothing at all as well. So it comes back to that grown up, so what challenge. And that goes at the risk manager board level, but it goes all the way down. So those that collect data right in the front line, do a bit of reporting and have access to all the systems, they need to be taking a role, which is, so what? What does this number tell us about the bigger picture? So we're always trying to build a story and a narrative informed by facts and data. Okay, so that's the whole piece. There is no silver bullet that says a system or a person will manage your risks. That's why we need guiding principles. So no, GOAT was not formed to be the silver bullet. It was actually formed for simplicity and quality of discussions, but the necessary data points that wrap the narrative around facts. Hopefully that moves us towards that discussion. It's not meant to say this is the answer for everything. There's a big onus on the users of the systems, but the managers of risk, to describe, understand, articulate the risks in a grown-up way, bring in numbers that help the narrative and understanding and deepen the thinking, but then to think innovatively, to challenge that status quo, to do things different, to be able to move the business forward, but then to track those numbers to see if we actually had an impact. So it's easy to spin around and say, I've thought of something out of the box, but when you're tracking the data hasn't changed. Maybe that idea hasn't been impactful enough. But it's, instead of managing the red lights and green lights of that action, we're actually tracking and managing that data.
Excellent. Danny, sticking with risk tools, another question from the audience. Many a times, chief risk officers present flashy decks to the board showcasing trends derived from various Big Four and other risk domain research and consulting firms. Does the board really show interest in specific risk-based observations? And would exec management not be biased or filter the risk that the CRO has shared with the board?
So that's a great question, and it happens all the time. Remember, the word transparency is one of my guiding principles. So if somebody's personal ambition or objective is to really put smoke and mirrors and to not add value or to deliberately not engage with the board, that's a problem, but that's for the board to turn around and say that, hello, I could see through you. You need to raise your game a little bit. In terms of data provided and researched by Big Four consultancies, to which I am an ex-member of, what I've seen at the board level is sometimes, okay, if there's a bit of insight, if there's a data-led piece of insight there, that's great, and that's research. Where they find most value, and I'm not saying only value, most value is where you could then connect that to an internal data point that the Big Four wouldn't have. So as an example, like a real life example, I was at a board and I've had a CIO give an update of one of the major data malware attacks. I think it was WannaCry, so a couple of years ago. And they gave a complete, well-researched presentation on WannaCry. And the chairman of the audit committee said, listened to the whole thing and said, you've given me a well-researched piece, but it's almost I know that, what else is there? And that's where I kind of connected and said, based on the WannaCry specific incident attack, there's a big focus on old technology. And all I said was, from my understanding of our company, we have a lot of that. We have a lot of those old technology things. So old that we don't even know where they are. Let's start talking about the actions we could take around this. And that just completely transformed it. It's fine to set the context from an outside piece of research. You must make a link to an internal observation, and then the actions end up being the gap between those two, or the expectations of.
Excellent. I'm going to fire another question at you from the member of the audience. With the approach that you've walked us through, how do you remove the conflict between short-term KPIs of the C-suite and the longer-term KPIs of the board and the stakeholder?
Oh, awesome. No, it's very true. Like, it's easy to say, okay, let's use all the data, and the data is short-term, and it's now, and or the last day or the last month. When you look at that holistic model, strategic, tactical, operational, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Operational risks, you definitely have data, and it's happening every day, so you should be counting things. Tactical layer, depending if it's projects and change, those are possibly traffic lights. But if it's a financial thing, it's a calculated number, financial number. But broader, the strategic risks or a strategic lens has different types of data, maybe no data, maybe things like HMV is not necessarily a data point, it's just a piece of information that says this technology is no longer relevant. There may be some external data that you could buy in, but they've got a time lag, they may not have the same credibility. So what this comes back to, again, no silver bullet, but going back to the guiding principles of having a holistic view, but then educating the governance committees to do a job. They are chosen to be those governance committee members because they have their 30, 40, 50 years of experience, diversity of skills, and good old common sense that says, what you're doing is short term, what you're measuring is short term, I have a bigger picture. I've got that holistic view. And if you can't see it yourself, I'm going to give you a hard time and have that healthy tension with management. So everyone has a job, and there's no hiding. And this is where when you see organizations get into big trouble, and then you see entire boards resigning, it's because they know that they haven't done the job that they needed to do to oversee and challenge in an effective way.
Excellent, Danny. Thank you very much. I see we've got 2 minutes on the clock, so let me squeeze another one in. What do you think about how we can show data related to brand and reputation risk or intangible assets?
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are industries of people that are deliberately trying to quantify or measure these things. So you need to find the individual experts that do that. There are different things around sentiment, social media. But this comes back to reputation is a stakeholder perspective. So me being such a stakeholder or persona driven person, I would say, right, reputation's too broad, too nebulous. Think about your key things. Is this a customer thing? Is this an employee thing? Is this a regulator thing? And then let's go in and find the right measures to give us insights that help us understand those stakeholders really well.
Danny, thank you so much for challenging us to think differently about risk and thinking about how we can best use data to illustrate the impacts that risks might have on a business. That does bring us to the end of this session. Our next webinar will be led by Warren Black, and he will be presenting on Risk 4.0, what the risk management discipline will need to offer during the age of the fourth industrial revolution. That will go live on the hour at 3 p.m. UK time, and I look forward to welcoming you back then. Thank you.